Racist cop points a gun at black orphan kid. Minutes later, he gets fired. Imagine walking down the street minding your own business when suddenly a police officer pulls out a gun and points it directly at you. It sounds like something out of a nightmare, but for one black teenager, it was his reality. What happened next will shock you and may just change the way you think about police accountability forever. In this video, we dive into the shocking and highly controversial moment when a police officer, for reasons that still spark debate, aimed his weapon at a black orphaned teen. The tension in the air was palpable, but what happened in the minutes that followed is where the real story begins. It was a quiet afternoon in a suburban neighborhood, the kind where most people go about their day without a second thought. The streets were lined with houses, each one looking just like the last, with manicured lawns and cars parked in driveways. But beneath the calm exterior, tensions were beginning to rise. At the center of it all was 16-year-old Jamal, a teenager whose life had already been shaped by hardship. Having lost both of his parents at a young age, Jamal had spent most of his childhood bouncing between foster homes. The streets had become familiar to him, a space he navigated with an air of caution that anyone in his situation would understand. He wasn't looking for trouble that day. He was simply walking home, passing through a neighborhood he'd walked through countless times before. But on that day, things took a dark turn. Jamal wasn't aware of the police car following him at first, its engine humming quietly behind him. The officer who had been patrolling the area had stopped to question Jamal, though the reason for the stop was unclear at that moment. Jamal, in his usual cautious manner, tried to stay calm, his eyes flicking nervously between the cop and the road ahead. He didn't know it yet, but the next few moments would set the stage for something that would capture the nation's attention. In a matter of seconds, the situation escalated. What started as a routine interaction turned into a life-threatening encounter, an officer pointing his gun directly at Jamal, an act that would spark outrage, debates, and eventually consequences. Without warning, the officer stepped out of the car, his hand resting firmly on his holstered weapon. Jamal, still unaware of why he was being approached, tried to maintain his composure, but a knot of tension formed in his stomach. He turned to face the officer, keeping his hands visible, just like he'd been taught in his foster homes. Don't make sudden moves, don't provoke. The officer, however, seemed to have already made up his mind about the situation. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't explaining himself. Instead, with a swift motion, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Jamal. The sound of the weapon being cocked echoed in Jamal's ears, a chilling reminder of how quickly everything had changed. The officer's eyes were fixed on him, his expression unreadable, but the power dynamic was clear. Jamal was at the mercy of the gun now pointed at his chest. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, the air thick with fear. What had he done to deserve this? He wasn't armed, wasn't resisting, wasn't even talking back. The only thing Jamal could think of in that moment was his past. How often he had been told by others, especially authority figures, that he didn't belong. But why would that same assumption be extended here, in this moment? The officer's behavior was puzzling at first. What had Jamal done to provoke such a drastic action? No weapons, no threats, no criminal behavior to speak of. Some argued later that the officer had simply overreacted, but others saw something darker at play. Could it have been racial bias? Did the officer view Jamal, a black teenager, as inherently dangerous, even though he was just walking home? These are questions that hung heavily in the air, even as the incident unfolded. Was it a reflex rooted in deep-seated prejudice? Or was it a case of an officer being overly eager to assert control? Whatever the reason, the moment was filled with a palpable sense of dread. Jamal, a young black boy with a history of trauma and hardship, found himself staring down the barrel of a gun simply because he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officer's assumption about Jamal's intentions seemed based on nothing more than the color of his skin, as if it were enough to justify the deadly force now trained on him. News of the incident spread quickly, igniting outrage both within the local community and across the country. Jamal, a teenager with no criminal history, had become the face of an unjust confrontation. The moment a bystander captured the scene on their phone and uploaded it to social media, the floodgates opened. what might have been a brief local story became an explosive national issue. In the community, the reactions were immediate and intense. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had seen Jamal grow up in the area were appalled. Many had known Jamal as a quiet, respectful kid, someone who had already faced so much loss in his life. To see him treated this way, especially without cause, felt like a betrayal to everything they believed in about fairness and justice. Parents expressed horror at the thought of their own children being treated the same way, while local leaders began to question how such an event could happen in their seemingly peaceful town. Social media played a pivotal role in magnifying the outrage. Once the footage of the officer pointing his gun at Jamal went viral, it became impossible for authorities to ignore. Hashtags like #JusticeForJamal and #End Racial Bias exploded on Twitter, with people sharing their own experiences of police misconduct or racial profiling. The video sparked debates that spread far beyond the boundaries of Jamal's town. Activists, celebrities, and ordinary citizens alike demanded accountability, calling for immediate action. The hashtag campaigns, online petitions, and viral posts were all tools used to put pressure on the police department. These digital movements, fueled by anger and solidarity, forced the conversation about police violence into the mainstream. While the video alone wasn't enough to tell the whole story, it was a catalyst. People were now paying attention, and they weren't letting go. As the story gained momentum, it became not just about one officer's actions, but about a broader conversation on race, police violence, and systemic injustice. Social media, often criticized for its ability to spread misinformation, was now being hailed for its role in amplifying a call for accountability that couldn't be ignored. As the outrage grew and public pressure mounted, the police department had no choice but to initiate an internal investigation into the officer's conduct. The local authorities issued a brief statement acknowledging the incident, though they were careful with their wording, calling it a concerning situation that would be thoroughly reviewed. The officer involved was placed on administrative leave, pending the results of the investigation, though many in the community felt this was just a temporary measure to buy time. Behind the scenes, the department began the process of gathering evidence, reviewing body camera footage, interviewing witnesses, and collecting any additional recordings that might shed light on what had transpired. The department also reached out to Jamal's family, though many felt the initial response was slow and lacking in genuine concern. Despite the officer's actions being captured on video, there was still a need for a formal review of the circumstances, including whether or not departmental protocols had been followed. As the investigation progressed, external oversight became a crucial component. Community members and civil rights organizations called for an independent review, fearing that the police department might not be able to conduct an unbiased investigation. Calls for the involvement of the state's attorney general or an outside law enforcement agency intensified. A few days later, the department announced that an external oversight body would assist in the review process, signaling a shift toward transparency. This move was meant to reassure the public that the investigation would be impartial and free from internal influence. Though the department insisted it would remain thorough and unbiased, the external oversight was a step toward restoring faith in the process. Many felt that without this independent review, the investigation could become just another routine internal matter, with the officer quietly reinstated. Public demand for accountability and justice had forced the hand of the police, ensuring that this case would not be swept under the rug. The real question, however, was whether this would lead to meaningful change, both for the officer involved and for the larger system that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. The investigation into the officer's conduct moved swiftly, propelled by the relentless public outcry and the pressure from civil rights organizations. Within days, the department released a statement confirming that the officer had been placed on administrative leave, but the real question on everyone's mind was whether this would lead to any actual consequences. As more details about the officer's background and prior conduct surfaced, the stakes became clearer. It wasn't just the incident with Jamal that was under scrutiny. It was the broader question of whether this officer had a history of poor judgment, racial bias, or misconduct. A little over a week after the video first went viral, the department made its move. The officer was officially terminated from his position. The announcement came through a press conference, where the police chief explained that after a thorough review of the incident, the officer's actions had violated multiple departmental protocols. The chief stated that the officer's decision to draw his weapon in such a manner without a clear threat or justification was not only dangerous but also inconsistent with the values the department claimed to uphold. The police department was quick to defend its decision, saying that it had conducted a comprehensive internal review, taking into account both the video footage and witness statements. According to the department, the officer's behavior was seen as an overreaction, one that put the teenager's life at risk without any reasonable grounds for such escalation. In the statement, the department emphasized its commitment to ensuring that officers who fail to adhere to appropriate conduct would face swift and decisive action. The firing, according to the department, was part of a broader effort to maintain accountability and uphold the public's trust. Still, there was skepticism about whether this was a true moment of accountability or simply a reaction to mounting pressure. While the department appeared to act quickly, critics questioned whether the investigation had been as thorough as it seemed. Had the officer's prior complaints or behavior been overlooked until this incident? Some argued that the officer's firing wasn't enough. What about broader systemic issues that allowed such an event to unfold in the first place? Nevertheless, the department made it clear that the officer would not be returning to the force. In the aftermath, the firing became a focal point for both praise and criticism. While some applauded the department for its swift action, others remained cautious, wondering if this would be the beginning of real change or just another isolated incident that ended with one person being held responsible, while the larger issues remained unaddressed. In the wake of the officer's termination, questions about the legal ramifications began to surface. While the officer was no longer on the force, the broader legal consequences of his actions were still unclear. The initial public reaction was one of relief that at least the officer would no longer have the authority to harm others, but many wondered if this was the end of the story, or just the beginning of a much larger legal process. The termination did not shield the officer from potential criminal liability. Legal experts noted that, depending on the circumstances, the officer's actions could be considered assault with a deadly weapon or even reckless endangerment. The fact that Jamal had not posed a threat, let alone a deadly one, seemed to make the officer's behavior not just reckless, but illegal. For a time, speculation ran wild about whether criminal charges would be brought against the officer. Would he be held accountable in a court of law, or would he simply slip away with his pension intact, with no further consequences for nearly taking a young life? Meanwhile, Jamal's family began to explore their own legal options. Civil suits were filed, seeking damages for the trauma he had experienced. The community rallied behind him, supporting his right to justice, not just through the police department, but in a court of law as well. The outcome of these cases would set a precedent, determining whether this incident would serve as a warning or a one-off occurrence in a system that often left victims of police misconduct without proper redress. On a broader scale, the incident highlighted deep-seated social issues that stretch far beyond one officer's actions. The video of Jamal, a black teenager, facing down a gun, sparked intense debates about the over-policing of communities of color, the racial biases inherent in many police departments, and the dangerous assumptions officers made about black people. Jamal's case was not isolated, far from it. For many, it represented just one example of a much larger pattern of police violence, especially against black individuals, who too often found themselves in life-threatening situations for doing nothing more than existing in public spaces. The social ramifications were immediate and widespread. The incident reignited calls for police reform, specifically around issues of racial profiling, the use of force, and officer training. Advocacy groups pushed for stronger regulations regarding how officers should handle situations involving unarmed civilians, particularly those from marginalized communities. National protests erupted in response, echoing the growing demands for accountability, transparency, and systemic change within law enforcement agencies. The incident also brought into question the role of police in society at large. For many, the question was no longer just about individual officers, but about a broader culture of policing that tolerated or even encouraged excessive force. Calls for the defunding of police departments, or at least reallocation of resources to mental health services, community outreach programs, and social services gained momentum. This was more than just one officer's wrong decision. It was part of a conversation about how the justice system treats people of color, the power dynamics between law enforcement and communities, and how much needs to change to prevent another tragedy like this from happening again. The incident sent shockwaves through the local community, especially within the Black population, who felt a heightened sense of vulnerability and fear. For many, Jamal was not just another teenager caught in an unfortunate situation. He was a reflection of the larger, systemic issues that had plagued the community for years. The neighborhood where Jamal lived had long been familiar with tensions between the police and residents, especially those in Black and Latino communities. But to see such blatant disregard for a young Black life, particularly in a seemingly mundane situation, ignited deep feelings of frustration and distrust. The Black community, already wary of police interactions, saw this as a stark reminder of how easily things could escalate when racial biases played a role in how officers viewed their neighbors. Many parents spoke out, expressing their fear that their own children could be the next target of such unjust treatment. Local churches, activist groups, and civil rights organizations quickly mobilized, holding town halls and organizing peaceful protests to demand justice for Jamal and push for broader reforms in policing. For Jamal, the incident had a profound personal impact. The trauma of being targeted by an officer with a gun, especially after everything he had already endured in life, was overwhelming. He had already faced the heartbreak of losing both parents and had spent his childhood navigating the foster care system, so this encounter with the police felt like another blow, one that reminded him just how fragile his safety could be. But he wasn't alone in facing this crisis. His community rallied around him, providing both emotional and practical support. Local organizations set up counseling and mental health services for Jamal and his family, ensuring they had access to professionals who could help them navigate the psychological aftermath of the traumatic event. These support systems were critical, offering Jamal the resources he needed to process the fear and anger that weighed heavily on him. Additionally, educational programs were put in place to help raise awareness about racial bias and the experiences of Black youth, with the aim of fostering a more empathetic understanding of Jamal's situation. While Jamal's case was specific, it also became a catalyst for broader change. The community began pushing for more proactive measures, calls for more training for local law enforcement on de-escalation tactics, racial sensitivity, and proper handling of interactions with young people, especially those from marginalized communities. Parents, community leaders, and activists demanded that the police department not just focus on punishment, but also engage in genuine dialogue with the community to rebuild trust. Jamal, supported by his community, slowly began to rebuild his life, but the echoes of that moment would stay with him forever. For the neighborhood, it became a pivotal moment, one that forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths and ask how much longer they would tolerate a system that so often placed their children in harm's way. Jamal's case was far from unique, though it was a stark reminder of the patterns of racial bias and police violence that continue to plague communities across the United States. Similar incidents have occurred throughout the years, where officers' misconduct, especially involving the use of excessive force, led to public outrage and, in some cases, serious consequences for the officers involved. One notable case was the shooting of 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio in 2014. Tamir, who was holding a toy gun, was shot by a police officer within seconds of arriving on the scene. Despite the clear lack of a real threat, the officer's quick decision to use deadly force was justified by many at the time, underscoring the racial biases that influence how police officers view Black individuals, particularly young Black children. The officer involved was never charged, though the case sparked nationwide protests and calls for police reform. Similarly, the case of George Floyd in 2020, though much more severe, showcased another instance of police misconduct leading to widespread repercussions. Floyd's death, caught on video for the world to see, became a turning point in the fight against police violence. The officer who killed Floyd, Derek Chauvin, was convicted of murder, marking a rare example of an officer facing true accountability for his actions. The incident led to protests not just in the United States, but across the globe, fueling the Black Lives Matter movement and inspiring calls for structural change within law enforcement. However, for many, Chauvin's conviction was not a symbol of consistent justice, but rather an outlier in a system that often fails to hold officers accountable. These cases, along with Jamal's, point to a troubling pattern. Racial bias and excessive force are far too often at the center of these encounters. Whether it's a traffic stop, a routine questioning, or an everyday interaction, Black individuals, especially Black youth, are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. The implicit racial biases held by many officers create a dangerous dynamic where people of color are frequently perceived as threats, regardless of their actual behavior. The question remains whether these incidents are isolated or whether they point to a deeper, more systemic issue. While some officers are held accountable, many others escape serious consequences, leaving the underlying problem of racial profiling and police violence largely unaddressed. Even when officers face termination or criminal charges, it's often seen as a reactive measure, a way to placate public outrage rather than a step toward real change. The pattern of misconduct, the lack of accountability, and the disproportionate impact on Black communities continue to be a central issue in the conversation about police reform and racial justice. Throughout this video, we've seen how a single moment, an officer pointing a gun at an unarmed Black teenager, can send shockwaves through a community and spark a nationwide conversation. The incident involving Jamal was not just about one officer's actions, but about the broader patterns of racial bias and police violence that continue to affect Black communities across the country. From the immediate public outrage to the investigation and eventual firing of the officer, this case highlighted the importance of holding law enforcement accountable for their actions. It's crucial to recognize that accountability in law enforcement isn't just about punishing bad behavior. It's about ensuring that officers understand the power they hold and the responsibility they have to protect and serve all communities equally. Without accountability, misconduct goes unchecked, and the cycle of violence and distrust continues. But accountability alone isn't enough. We must also address the root causes of racial bias in policing, such as systemic racism and flawed training practices, which disproportionately target people of color, especially Black youth. We've seen this pattern play out time and time again in high-profile cases like Tamir Rice, George Floyd, and now Jamal. Change is needed, and it's not just up to one community or one incident. It requires all of us to engage in difficult conversations, push for meaningful reforms, and hold our institutions responsible. This is where you come in. If this video has made you think, take that next step. Talk to your friends and family about systemic racism. Learn about the ways police violence and racial profiling affect marginalized communities. Support organizations pushing for real change, and raise your voice in favor of reforms that prioritize accountability, de-escalation, and community safety. We all have a part to play in creating a system that truly serves and protects everyone.